It is that time of year. Joy and hope and longing and excitement, spirit. And I'm not just talking about Hallmark movies. Some of you, I'm sure, are very, very excited about these movies. I hate them with every fiber of my soul. Wow, okay. I know people who like those movies are always like, why do you pick on them? Who cares? I don't know either. I did see a tweet on Twitter last year that cracked me up about them, though. It went like this. I watched a Hallmark movie backward. A woman in an ugly Christmas sweater dumped her loser small-town boyfriend to pursue a law degree in New York City, where she lived happily ever after in pencil skirts and amazing shoes. That sounds about right. Actually, when I say it's this kind of year, or this time of year, for me, that means Advent. And it is possible that if you grew up like I did, you didn't really hear that word, except in conjunction maybe with chocolate calendars where you got a piece of chocolate every day, or possibly a wreath that was lit in your church. But leaning into Advent wasn't something that was delved into too deeply. And yet, as an adult, I'll be honest with you, I found incredible meaning in waiting on Christmas and instead practicing Advent. Because while I love Christmas, and let me tell you, I'm going to Christmas parties and making Christmas cookies and buying Christmas presents. I don't want to seem like that's all delayed, but coming to worship in a sense of Advent, I find to be so incredibly meaningful, because Advent is about longing and it's about preparation. It's about naming the in-between the birth of Jesus and the return of Jesus. It's about anticipating the cradle, but also recognizing that we believe historically Jesus has come. So our anticipation for the cradle looks like an anticipation of a king who returns to bring his followers to be with him forever. That longing is helpful for me in a time and a space in a world we live in, where there is so much unmet expectation, so much hurt, so much struggle, so much war, so much battling within families, so much hope for things that are unseen or unyet experienced. And so Advent is a place to bring that mourning and spend some time in it and hope that it transforms into hope because of the reality of Jesus' coming. We know that Jesus will be born on Christmas. And so as we have that certainty, it begins to shape our hopes that we have in the meantime in our life that have not yet been met. God shows up with his promises. And learning to be patient, learning to hope actively, is a discipline that we can learn because it builds a hope within us that becomes fulfilled. And so we're going to talk a lot about hope this month, and particularly around the theme of Advent. We're going to look at 4 stories the next 4 Sundays of people who had hope and who met God's help in the midst of their hope. But today is the first Sunday of Advent. It's also the first day of the Christian calendar. And you may or may not be familiar with the Christian calendar. This January 1st is not the first day of Christian calendar. Advent is the first day of the Christian calendar. And whether or not you recognize it, you celebrate the Christian calendar to some degree, because there is Easter, and there is Christmas, and there is Advent, and there is Lent. These things you might have heard of. So I've got a quick, just to start us off video, 3-minute video of how the Christian calendar works and how it invites us into a cycle of learning about the story of Jesus and who the church is on an annual basis. Would you watch this video with me?
Christians are people who tell time differently. It's not as if they avoid clocks and calendars. No one escapes that. But from the beginning, they have engaged in a very different kind of rhythm, finding themselves in a world where time has been transformed into an instrument of God's revelation. In other words, Christians made their own calendar and relived the story of God throughout the year. Let me demonstrate. So the church calendar is divided into two halves. The first half starts in December with Advent, and it stretches all the way to Pentecost in May or June. And this part of the year tells the story of Jesus, from his birth and death, his resurrection and ascension. And the second half of the year starts at Pentecost and then goes all the way to Christ the King Sunday in late November. It tells the story of God's people, the church. For the next 6 months, the church follows this calendar and relives the story of Jesus. As any good story does, we'll start right at the beginning with chapter 1. This is where we observe the season of Advent and wait with expectation and prepare for the birth of Jesus. As chapter 1 ends, we move to chapter 2. This chapter brings news of great joy as we celebrate Jesus' birth and the feast of Christmas. We then turn the page to chapter 3. We remember the appearance of Jesus to the entire world, represented by the visiting Magi from afar. The story begins its climax with chapter 4. This ushers in the solemn season of Lent, where, like Jesus' real desert, we spend 40 days in a metaphorical desert, pulling away from created comforts to make space for God. This chapter is long and difficult, but the joy of chapter 5 is worth the wait. Jesus' resurrection from the dead makes Easter Sunday the ultimate celebration, which then leads to the 6th and final chapter. Jesus' story concludes not only with his ascension into heaven, but with the coming of his Spirit, sent to create a new community, the church, to continue his work on earth. To listen to the church tell the story of the Lord is to listen to the Lord of the church. Reliving the first 6 chapters of the year not only shapes our worship, but it brings Christ into our very lives today. In Advent, Christmas, and Epiphany, it's as if we're with him in his birth and earthly ministry. In Lent, Easter, and Pentecost, we are again right by his side through death, burial, and resurrection. Living our faith through the lens of Jesus sanctifies our own lives. For his is an epic story of darkness and light, grief and joy, struggle and rest. It mirrors the tensions and complexity of our own stories. And through it all, we're placed right in the middle of the great drama of God's redemption of the world. So you're invited to live the Christian year these next 6 months. The ordinary season is past. It's time to inhabit the story of God.
So I think that's a helpful, quick 3-minute explanation of what the calendar looks like and how the year begins and starts with this moment of hope and of longing. And Advent isn't a time of fasting like Lent is, but it is a time of preparation. It's a time of ordering our hopes. It's a time of recognizing what it is we truly are hoping for and longing for. So Advent is in some ways a time where we wait on the Lord in this season of Advent because many of us are worn down to the bone. But also, as a Christian people, we cannot help but be afflicted by hope. It's this recognizing of this tension, of tiredness, of end of the year, of a race to the finish line, but also a hope that permeates who we are. And so in order to look into this hope and this longing, I wanted to start by looking at the story of Hannah. Hannah was a mom, the mom of Samuel, who 2 of our Old Testament books are named after. But when we meet Hannah, we meet a barren woman, a woman who longs to have children, but has not yet had the ability to do so. And if that isn't tension enough, the tension grows thicker by the moment. And so I want to invite you into her story in 1 Samuel chapter 1, verses 1 through 20. This is a woman of unmet hope, who transfers her desperation to God in prayer, and I think becomes a template for us as a people of hope as well. Would you join me in reading 1 Samuel chapter 1, verses 1 through 20, and would you stand with me as we honor the reading of the word of the Lord? There was a certain man from Ramathaim, I think, a Zuphite from the hill country of Ephraim, whose name was Elkanah, son of Jeroham, I think, the son of Elihu, the son of Tohu, the son of Zuph. If by chance you're pregnant and you're looking for a good biblical name, may I recommend Zuph. Zuph was an Ephraimite. He had 2 wives. One of them was called Hannah, and the other Penina, I think. Oh, man. Penina had children, but Hannah had none. Year after year, this man went up from the town to worship and sacrifice to the Lord Almighty at Shiloh, where Hophni and Phinehas, the 2 sons of Eli, were priests of the Lord. Whenever the day came for Elkanah to sacrifice, he would give portions of the meat to his wife, Penina, and to all of her sons and daughters. But to Hannah he gave a double portion because he loved her, and the Lord had closed her womb. Because the Lord had closed Hannah's womb, her rival kept provoking her in order to irritate her. This went on year after year. Whenever Hannah went up to the house of the Lord, her rival provoked her till she wept and would not eat. Her husband, Elkanah, would say to her, "Hannah, why are you weeping? Why don't you eat? Why are you downhearted? Don't I mean more to you than 10 sons?" Once, when they had finished eating and drinking in Shiloh, Hannah stood up. Now Eli the priest was sitting on his chair by the doorpost of the Lord's house. In her deep anguish, Hannah prayed to the Lord, weeping bitterly. And she made a vow, saying, "Lord Almighty, if you will only look on your servant's misery and remember me, and not forget your servant, but give her a son, then I will give him to the Lord for all the days of his life, and no razor will ever be used on his head." As she kept on praying to the Lord, Eli observed her mouth. Hannah was praying in her heart, and her lips were moving, but her voice was not heard. Eli thought she was drunk. And he said to her, "How long are you going to stay drunk? Put away your wine." "Not so, my lord," Hannah replied. "I am a woman who is deeply troubled. I have not been drinking wine or beer. I was pouring out my soul to the Lord. Do not take your servant for a wicked woman. I have been praying here out of my great anguish and grief." Eli answered, "Go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant you what you have asked of him." She said, "May your servant find favor in your eyes." Then she went her way and ate something, and her face was no longer downcast. Early the next morning they arose and worshiped before the Lord, and then went back to their home in Ramah. Elkanah made love to his wife Hannah, and the Lord remembered her. So in the course of time, Hannah became pregnant and gave birth to a son. She named him Samuel because I asked the Lord for him. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. You may be seated. When Charisse and I were first married, we had a long running battle. And that battle was functionally, when are we going to have kids? Charisse's answer was yesterday. What's taking so long? And my answer was basically, please, please, please let me finish seminary. This was functionally our battle. And it's not as though Charisse wasn't on the same page with me. She agreed that that was the wise decision, but her longing was to be a mother, and waiting was not a discipline that she wanted to undertake. This was a battle. And so the day came that I finished seminary and went and took my first church in Cincinnati, Ohio. And we had barely finished unpacking the church when she informed me that my time was up. And it was time for us to now have a child. Well, I was out of arguments, so I agreed. Charisse was about 3 years past her readiness, and so she was very impatient and decided very quickly that she thought she might have trouble conceiving a child. I disagreed with this assessment, but at the same time, what do I know? And so she brought me along to a fertility specialist. And she had a conversation with the fertility specialist, and the fertility specialist agreed that, okay, we'll do something for you, but what I need you to do first, take this prescription to your pharmacy, but before you take the medicine, take a pregnancy test because it could cause harm if you're pregnant. And so I went back to my office to work, and Charisse went off to Target to get this prescription. All of this seemed reasonable and normal to me to this point, until I got a phone call about 20 minutes later, which I interpreted to be from literally the Target bathroom. She has since told me that it actually took place in the parking lot of the Target, where she informed me that she found out that she was pregnant. To which I wanted to go into a "see, I told you so," because that's my inclination. But I didn't go there because I figured that was wise. What I went to instead was, why are you telling me that we're having our first child from Target's bathroom? Why did you take a pregnancy test in Target's bathroom? Why didn't you take the medicine and test home like a normal person? And then we could look at the results together. I just couldn't wait. This is how we found out we were going to have our first child. Not very normal. Now, if you know anything about our first child, we, of course, couldn't even have her in the hospital. So that whole adventure was an absolute experience with birthing Mackenzie. But the issue of family planning, of pregnancy, of having children, of longing for them and not being able to have them is a deeply emotional, difficult season in a person's life. Planning when you're going to have children is difficult. Waiting for when you're going to have children is difficult. And it is especially difficult when you believe you're in the season to have children, you want children, your partner wants children, and yet conception is not happening. Each layer becomes more difficult than the next. Now, rewind yourself about 3,000 or so years, and there's a whole nother layer to this story. Hannah wants to have a child. Her husband wants to have a child with her. She cannot have a child. You can imagine her grief in not being able to have a child, especially in a society where that is a woman's value and worth, at least perceived. Now add another layer that we don't much talk about today, that of having a rival wife. A rival wife. I looked up where else this word rival was used in the Old Testament, and it was often tied with that commandment of you shall have no other gods before me, no rivals with God. Rival wife. There were a lot of rivalry college football games on yesterday. That's a lot of hatred tied to the word rival. And not only does Hannah have a rival wife, I can't even hardly squeeze those words out of my mouth. You know, sometimes there's TV shows about polygamists and they try to call each other sister wives. There's not much sisterly love happening in those situations. Rival wife, that's what's happening. But the rival wife seems to be more bountiful than an orange tree. this woman seems to get pregnant at will, and Hannah appears to be barren. So why are they rivals according to this story? Well, Peninnah has herself multiple kids, and she gets a normal portion of meat, we're told. Her husband goes and sacrifices the meat that's left over. She is given her normal portion. But Hannah, on the other hand, who can't have kids, is being given a double portion of meat for herself. I mean, could you imagine what Peninnah thinks of this other wife? She's trying to provide for the only children that her husband is having, and yet he seems to prefer this other woman so deeply that she gets more than enough to feed herself. Economically, this doesn't make any sense. So you can understand why Peninnah doesn't like Hannah, other than the fact that they're both trying to be with the same man, if you will. Now, Peninnah makes it difficult on Hannah. They're rivals because she has an easy time getting pregnant, and Hannah appears barren. And so Peninnah has performed her wifely duties, and yet she is objectively less loved by Elkanah. Hannah is favorited by Elkanah, even though she is unable to provide children. You can see why there is a rivalry here. And Peninnah makes life difficult on Hannah by not just simply having children at will right in front of her, but rubs it in her face and insults her and makes fun of her because she feels like she's deserving of more than she gets. And Hannah becomes more and more depressed, even though her husband is saying just incredibly Valentine's-like things like, sure, you can't have kids, but don't you see that I love you? Isn't that worth more than 10 sons? Yeah, sure, that seems to be the case, buddy. So what does Hannah do with her problems? Because she has got problems. She has got issues. What does Hannah do? Well, one day when the family is in Shiloh, Shiloh is roughly where the people of Israel would go and worship before Jerusalem was established under David, before the temple was built under Solomon. Shiloh was where the Ark of the Covenant was held, where God's presence was, and the priest Eli would be there to help people who came to pray or to have their sins forgiven. And one day the family has made their journey there in order to atone for their sins for the year. Eli has performed his sacrifices and come back to the family, and Hannah is unsatisfied with what she has received from God to this point. So she herself bucks the system. Normally, the man of the house brings a sacrifice into the house of God. Hannah decides she's going to show up on her own and pray. And apparently, Hannah is the kind of person when she prays like a drunk person. Because that's all Eli could possibly understand what is happening. Eli understands the system, and the system works, okay? A man brings an animal, they cut the head off, they sprinkle some blood around, sins are forgiven, the meat goes home with the man. There aren't very often women laying around the altar moving their mouth without words coming out of it. This is not the plan or the system. And so Eli looks upon her, hears nothing, she looks like she's talking, and he says to her, hey, put down the Jack Daniels and go home. This is not appropriate behavior for the altar. And Hannah says, no, you misunderstand. That is not what is happening. And listen to her words here that we read earlier. She says, not so, my Lord. I am a woman who is deeply troubled. I am a woman who is deeply troubled. I have not been drinking wine or beer. I was pouring out my soul to the Lord. Now this is an Advent text. This is an Advent text. We are a people who can identify with Hannah. Maybe not this moment, but there's been moments in our lives where we have been deeply troubled, deeply wounded, deeply scarred, deeply confused, deeply hurt. You may come here today that way. You may have been that way last month. It may have been 10 years, but you have been this person before, I suspect. I am a woman who is deeply troubled. Her wounds, her trouble is so deep that when she goes to the Lord to pray, her desperation comes out and presents as drunkenness. Because when she lets it out before the Lord, she doesn't seem to be in control of herself anymore. This is a deep, deep wound that Hannah has. And so Hannah prays, and Eli sees her pray. And her prayer is a fascinating prayer because it is not about telling God what God ought to do. Her prayer instead is a prayer that anticipates both getting and giving. And this is a prayer that we can begin to shape ourselves for in a time of Advent. Hannah here doesn't get in God's face and wag her finger and tell God what she deserves or what she ought to have or how her life would be made easier if God would just tear down the barriers and give her what she wants. Her prayer instead is a promise that she has skin in the game with God, that if God will give her the son that she longs for, she will raise him as what's called a Nazirite. If you know the stories of John the Baptist, he appeared to be a Nazirite. That there would be, Samson was a Nazirite. There would be no clippers that would ever touch the head. The hair would grow. They would eat and they would drink in a different, more moderate, more abstinent ways. Their life would be dedicated to God wholly and entirely. And Hannah was here making decisions for her unborn child, promising that if God would hear her prayer, she would immediately give this child back to God. That it was not that she wanted something for herself, but that she wanted in her longings to share the fruit of her desires with God. She wasn't telling God what God owed her. She was making a bargain with God. We talk a lot in the church about having a relationship with God. We want you to have a relationship with God. It's true, we do. But a relationship is two-way activity. It's not just simply us taking from God and saying, look, I am God's. And Hannah shows us this well. She's not just demanding. She's saying, if you will answer my prayer, I will leverage your answer for the sake of your kingdom. I will give back to you what you give to me. What is my joy can become your joy. What becomes my gift can become your gift. You can use this child in any way you see fit. This is what relationship with God does and could look like. She anticipates in the prayer already both getting and giving. And so I ask you, in this Advent season, leading into Christmas, the end of the year, I ask you, what is it that you are hoping for? What is it that's off in your heart? What is it that you need, that you want, that you crave, that you long for? What is it that the trajectory of your life is aiming at? It could be everything from fertility. It could be you just wish your kids would behave, or that your spouse would get it together, or that your job would improve, or that your finances would get in line, or that property would sell. It could be to beat depression or anxiety, or to finish school, or to finally achieve that goal. It could be to find inner or even world peace. What is it that you're longing for? Hannah teaches us some disciplines in a season of longing. She teaches us to anticipate both getting and giving. Don't simply pray to God as if God is a genie. Begin to listen and speak and ask God to show you why your prayer hasn't been answered. Ask God how it is that you can give back your prayer. Partner with God for the sake of the kingdom in what you're asking God for. And see if God answers a prayer that shows you have skin in the game. Hannah also teaches us to not be afraid to barter with God. Now, that's not the same as trying to manipulate God, but come to God in honesty. There are many times in the Old Testament specifically where people barter with God. I think of the time that God wanted to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, and Abraham kept counting God back and down. What if there are 50 holy people? What if there are 40 holy people? What if there are 30 people who are righteous? And eventually God decides to not smite Sodom and Gomorrah because of Abraham's bartering. What would it look like for us to talk with God and not just at God? To share with God what it is that we long for, to petition, but also ask God what it is we could do to leverage our hopes for Him. The next thing is to learn to have some skin in the game. Be not afraid to offer your children back to God as an example. The story of Hannah has always resonated with me because my parents were married in 1973, and they tried from day one to have a child. And over the years, I was born in 1981, over those 8 years, my parents distanced themselves from church. They were desperate and sad and away from home, and all they wanted was a child, and they couldn't have one. And this story became shaping for my family because my mom promised to God, in a distance from God, that I could be his. And then upon my birth, they went back to church for the first time in years and remained there for years. My family was given back to God because of my very birth. I see in this story, so much of my story, how we can give to God from our life and anticipate that God can meet our hopes and leverage it for much more than we're hoping for. This season, as we head towards Christmas, we're going to spend time with hope. We're going to talk about desires and longings and indeed the biblical concept of hope. This is what we're going to wrestle with. This is what we're going to sit in together. And I want you to see that these words are much more active than we very rarely ever think about. They're not just passive nouns, but they're verbs, they're hard actions. We can desire, we can long, we can hope in ways that are active and not just passive, not just sitting back in pews as sort of a cosmic pawn piece of God, hoping that things break our way eventually. But we can be active like Hannah, showing up in places that we don't belong, confusing the powers that be, and doing so because we're desperate for God's movement in our life. I think Hannah shows up at the altar because she believes that if God would hear her, God would answer her prayer. So she went to the holiest place she knew and became desperate at God's feet. And God answered her prayer. Her hope for years had been passive. And when it became active, when she began moving herself, when she began telling God how this gift to her would become a gift back to God, God moved on her behalf. And her son Samuel would end up being the prophet who anointed David as king. He would become the major voice in between the time of the judges and the kings in the history of Israel. Very few children would ever be born that would offer such important spiritual authority as Samuel. And his story begins with a woman whose hope becomes desperate. It becomes active, and her prayers begin to be answered. So today, as we finish, I want you to see, I want you to experience, I want you to know that hope that is active often comes out of our worst situations. The very thing that we feel defines us, but in every negative way. And the scripture never, ever, ever turns its back on our bad seasons in life, where we're not measuring up, where we're not feeling it, where things aren't coming together. When we're struggling, when we're hurting, we can so often interpret that as God's absence. But Scripture reminds us over and over and over that in our worst seasons, when we long for the most, is when God often is the most present. The Apostle Paul put it in Romans this way, and I think it's so helpful to think about it in these terms. He says, we also celebrate in our sufferings. You may come here suffering today, and celebration may be the absolute last word that you want to hear. But hear Paul's point, because the logic tracks. We celebrate in our sufferings, knowing that suffering brings about perseverance, and perseverance, proven character. And proven character brings about hope. And hope does not disappoint, because the love of God has been poured out within our hearts through the Holy Spirit who was given to us. The Spirit is pouring himself out upon you, even in your time of suffering, even in your season of disappointment, even in your season of unmet expectation. If you arrive here today struggling for whatever reason, God is not far off. And the presence of God meeting you in your desperation eventually leads to a hope that doesn't disappoint. Hope can be a season that is long and difficult. We like to think we want to be a people of hope, but honestly, being a people of hope means something's not right, something is off. The season of hope can be difficult, and it can be treacherous. But God is not far away from your hope. God is not far away from your suffering. God is not far away from your hurt. God is not far away from your unmet expectations. God is drawing near to you in this season of Advent. And as hope begins to emerge, and I pray that it does, know that it is the presence of God working through your circumstances. Hope does not disappoint. God will make all things new. God sees your suffering. And whatever hope begins to emerge is a seed planted by God. Follow it, tend to it, offer it back to him, and see what amazing beauty God can create out of your season of desperation. As we close today, the altars will be open. If you want to come and bring your story of desperation or hurt, if you want to bring the story of the one thing that you're longing for, if you want to enter into the season of Advent leading to Christmas saying, I want to see my hopes met, come and pray. Name it before God. Don't be passive. The story today is about a woman who prayed on the altar looking drunk. Don't stay in your seat with your hands lowered, simmering over your hope. Follow the pattern, bring it to God, and see what God might do in partnering with you. Would you stand to sing this final song?